I want to share with you a number of brief arguments for the reliability of the Gospels, and they're all written up in a book I wrote called Can We Trust the Gospels? You can see on this slide the literature that's the main record of the most important person alive at the time of Jesus, the Roman Emperor Tiberius. You can see there are four main biographies of his life, and there are four main biographies of Jesus' life. And what's interesting is when you look in the second column, you can see how long each of them is. In the case of Tiberius, Velleius Paterculus wrote 6,489 words, Tacitus 48,200. These are approximate numbers, of course. Suetonius, just over 9,000. Cassius Dio, just over 14,000. When we look at the four Gospels at 18, 11, 19 and 15,000 each, you can see that on the whole they're longer than the records we have of the life of Tiberius, with one exception, and that is Tacitus. But when Tacitus was writing, it's not strictly a biography, it's actually the annals of the time of Tiberius. That is, all the things that happened during his reign, lots of things that aren't strictly about Tiberius. So then, when you look at the amount of biography there is of the most famous person alive at the time of Jesus, namely the Roman Emperor, we find out there's at least as much biography of Jesus. And that's one of the things that's so astounding. Jesus was not from the elite background. He came from Nazareth. He's not someone who, in terms of the Roman political structure, was an important person. But the fact that we have as many records of his life as we have of the Roman Emperor at the time is really astounding. We can then look in the next column and look at when our earliest manuscripts of each of these writings is. And we see that with the case of Tiberius, the manuscripts for his biographies come from the 9th century, C9, or even later, in the case of Velleius Paterculus, they come from the 16th century. That's after the invention of printing. Whereas the manuscripts we have of the Gospels come from the 3rd or even sometimes the 2nd century. So in other words, the material is very early. Then we look at the gap there is between the time of Tiberius and the writings, or the time of Jesus' ministry and the writings about him. And here you can see that in the case of Tiberius, well, Tiberius was the emperor from the year 14 through to the year 37. So when Velleius Paterculus is writing around the year 30, he's writing during the reign of Tiberius. So that's very, very close. But the other three are all considerably later. Tacitus after the year 110, Suetonius after the year 120, Cassius Dio after the year 200. So in other words, the gap that we have in the case of Tacitus, well, it's a minimum of between 37 and 110, so it's a minimum there of 73 years, and other writings actually are longer than that. In the case of Jesus, people debate the dates of the Gospels, but what I've given you in the final column is the sorts of dates that are given by some skeptical writers about the New Testament, people like Bart Ehrman, a well-known skeptic. And so even using dates given by skeptics, we can see that the four Gospels are considerably closer to the time of Jesus than three of the four biographies of the Emperor Tiberius. But there's that one exception, the one that's closer for Tiberius, and that's Velleius Paterculus. But actually, he's thought to be the least reliable of all of them, because he was in the emperor's pay, and he only ever says wonderful things about the emperor, whereas the other three would tell you that Tiberius was pretty mean to his enemies and even meaner to many of his friends. And so it does seem that Velleius Paterculus is propaganda, and he's doing the sorts of things he's doing because he thinks he'll be killed otherwise, and he's in the emperor's pay. Now you might say, well, yes, but the gospel writers who wrote about Jesus were also biased. Yes, bias, there's nothing wrong with having a strong interest in a position. If someone accuses you of something, you might well want to defend yourself. That's fine. It doesn't mean your witness should be written off. But what we can say is that there is nothing in it for the disciples of Jesus in earthly terms that they're going to do better out of. They're not going to get more finance if they write biographies about Jesus. Everything would be against that. And so it's really quite striking, just at a starting point, that there are as many records of the life of Jesus as there are of the Emperor Tiberius. So when people say, where's the evidence for Jesus? The answer is there's actually an abundance of evidence. Now, of course, there are some differences. For Tiberius, there are also coins. For Jesus, there are also records of letters that are sent between early Christians that talk about how things were changed and transformed because of him. But let's now do a deep dive into those 4 records of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, the 4 Gospels, and look at this simple question. Do they know what they're writing about? Are they familiar with the material that they're seeking to write about? So the first test we can do is the test of geography. And we can simply take a list of all of the names that there are in the Gospels of places. Here we've got a list of towns mentioned in the Gospels. And one of the things you can do is just put a tick in each of the boxes or columns when a particular town or village is mentioned by a Gospel writer. And what you can see there immediately is that there are quite a lot of towns mentioned, and also that none of the Gospels mentions exactly the same ones as the others. So very simply, we can derive from that they haven't all copied off each other. They've got a certain level of familiarity with the geography. It's not just that they know towns, they also know places that are smaller than towns. Matthew and Mark name a little garden on the Mount of Olives called Gethsemane, where they say Jesus went to pray just before he was betrayed and then crucified. And one of the interesting things about Gethsemane is it's not a name that's known from elsewhere. So you might say, well, okay, it could have been made up. But Gethsemane has a certain linguistic structure which is very appropriate for the locality, because Geth means a press, and Semene is to do with oil. And remember, this is on the Mount of Olives, and what do you get from olive trees? You get oil. So all of these things come together to show you that this is the sort of detail you could only make up if you were familiar with the local language. So in other words, we know from this, these little details, that either the gospel writers are very close to the event, so close, or the place, so that they know the name of a little garden near Jerusalem, or they're close enough to Jerusalem that they know the way people spoke at the time. Either way, they're familiar with material. You can also look at the way they talk about the topography, that's the shape of the land. And you can see that they know where the land goes up and down. Many times, rather than saying that Jesus went from A to B, they'll actually say he went up or he went down. And they use these terms correctly, these verbs, many times. Jesus is said to have told a story, the story of the Good Samaritan, that goes like this. A certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. So that's in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 10. And it says he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Well, one of the things we know is that Jericho is the lowest city on earth, and Jerusalem is about 750 meters above sea level, and Jericho about minus 250. So you're going down a kilometer on that road. Of course it's down, and the gospel writers just know this. The topography of Judea, Samaria and Galilee, very undulating, and they're using the verbs go up and go down the right way. To give you some more examples, Nazareth is about 350 meters above sea level, and the Sea of Galilee is actually below sea level, just like the Dead Sea. And so when Jesus moved from one place to another, from Nazareth, his former home, to Capernaum, which becomes his home later, he's going down. In Luke chapter 4, it says he went down to Capernaum. In John's Gospel, likewise, it says he came down to Capernaum. You can also see this in John chapter 4, where there's a dialogue between a man who wants Jesus to come down and heal his child, and Jesus, and the man's in Capernaum, and he says, come down, and Jesus is in Cana, which is above sea level at the time. So in other words, all of these things fit together. There's a saying which is attributed to Jesus in two of the Gospels, in Matthew and in Luke. And it's a saying which is a series of woes against various towns that Jesus had visited. It goes like this. I'm reading from Matthew chapter 11, and actually this version comes from Luke chapter 10, verses 13 to 15. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, those are cities further up the coast, they would have repented long ago, sitting in sackcloth and ashes. But it will be more bearable in the judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You shall be brought down to Hades. So he mentions three local cities: Chorazin, which is a relatively small place, Bethsaida, and Capernaum. And people debate the exact location of Bethsaida by a matter of a few miles, nothing more. But one thing we can establish very clearly is that all three of these towns or villages are on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. In other words, they're in a very small area, and it would be very natural for someone to address all of these. And what that shows is that the gospel writers are familiar with the place. You might say, well, surely people can make up place names, and it doesn't have to mean the story's authentic. Of course it doesn't mean the story's authentic, but it means this. If the gospel writers, for instance, lived in Italy or Greece or Turkey or Syria or Egypt, there would be no easy way for them to get hold of details like the names of villages in Galilee, because they couldn't go into a bookstore and simply get lists of names. They could get it, of course, if they interviewed people who'd travelled a lot. But remember, travelling is quite expensive and somewhat dangerous. And to think that all four gospel writers have done this in order to get the geographical details for their gospels would at least mean that all four gospel writers had to be doing serious research prior to writing their books. In other words, you can't just think that these are trivial, throwaway lines that they're not taking seriously. There's been either familiarity with the land or a lot of research go behind this. You can also look at what are the possible written sources they could get this information from. And I've gone through every possibility here. You could think of Strabo, who is the great geographer, writing before the time of the Gospels. But of course, he'd never actually been to the land. He'd never been to Judea or Galilee. And so you can't actually rely on him for the information. Pliny the Elder, also a great scientist and geographer, hadn't ever been. Tacitus hadn't ever been. So you can't use those. A couple of writers who had been, Philo from Egypt went up briefly, and Ptolemy from a generation or two later, the great astronomer, had also been briefly, but again, he couldn't give you a lot of detail. One person who did have a lot of detail was the Jewish historian Josephus, but unfortunately he doesn't mention all the names of the places in the towns that are in the Gospel, so he can't be the source. And then there are lots of places mentioned later on, about 4 centuries later, in the Jewish Talmud. But again, that's too late for the Gospel writers to have copied from them. So in other words, there's no written source the Gospel writers can go to in order to get the information that they present. Either they have done it because they've been in the land, or they've had really detailed conversations with people who've been in the land. Those are the two basic possibilities. We can also say that when we contrast the 4 Gospels with various things that are called apocryphal Gospels, that some people would like to say, oh, shouldn't these be given equal value, that actually come from several generations after our 4 Gospels. They're a bit like fan fiction. They're trying to use the style of the Gospels in order to promote a particular message. And whereas the 4 Gospels mention 12 to 14 towns each, a total of 23 between them, we actually see that the other Gospels don't have that sort of familiarity. One of the longer ones is called the Gospel of Philip, and it only knows of 2 towns, one of which is Jerusalem, which is the capital, therefore not a very impressive piece of knowledge, and the other one is Nazareth, which it thinks is Jesus' middle name. So again, not very impressive. A couple more Gospels, the Gospel of Peter, which isn't by the Apostle Peter, just put in his name centuries later, and the Gospel of the Saviour. They also only know of 1 town each, that's the town of Jerusalem, again the capital, not impressive. And the next earliest 13 apocryphal Gospels I've looked at have a total of no town names. So if you like, that's a very good control group. If you like, you've got the 4 Gospels and you've got these other ones, and people were very happy back then if they were writing stuff to try and promote a religious message about using the brand of Jesus to try and promote that message. They were very happy just to write without mentioning particular geography. That wouldn't have made things more plausible to people back then. But we got this contrast between the 4 Gospels, which just naturally mention all this sort of stuff, and these other texts from later on that don't. Another test we can run is actually personal names. What are the characters in the Gospels called? And nowadays we actually have statistics, we have data on what were the most common names. You can look at old bone boxes, because when people died they would put their lay their bodies out for a while until they rotted, then they'll put the bones into boxes, and sometimes they write the name on the box. Or the historian Josephus mentions a number of different individuals. Or the Dead Sea Scrolls mention various individuals. If you take all of those things and you put those statistics together, you can see that the most common name inside the Gospels and the book of Acts for a Jewish male from the land of Palestine was Simon. That's also the most common name outside the Gospels. The second most common name was Joseph. It's also the second most common outside the Gospels. So there's a real correlation we have here, and it works with female names as well. The most popular female name inside the Gospels is Mary. That's also the most popular name for a Jewish woman of the land outside the Gospels. So we see a lot going together there. And you can also contrast that with what Jews were called in other lands. There are lots and lots of Jews spread around the Mediterranean. So you can go to Egypt and you can find some quite different names that people have there. And you could go to the catacombs in Rome and you can see Jewish names there. You can go to Aphrodisias in Turkey and you can see names that people had there. And you can see that Jews had different names in different countries. So it's not just that the writers have thought, oh, let's put in some Jewish characters there. They've actually given the right characters for the place. And when we look at the statistics, and this is some work by Richard Borkham, we can actually see that there is the right proportion of those names. So for instance, Simon is the most common name outside the Gospels, 15 to 16%. Inside the Gospels at about 18%. Simon and Joseph, those top two names. If we take the top 9 male names outside the Gospels, about 41%. Inside the Gospels, about 40%. Incredibly close. When you get a larger data sample, things just go very well together. With the women's names, there's a little bit less imagination, a little bit less variety, but still the statistics broadly align. And when we look at a list of Jewish names from Egypt, automatically you can see some differences. There are some popular names in Egypt, Sabbathias, Dositheus, Pappus, Ptolemaeus, which weren't at all popular amongst the Jews of Judea and Galilee, and yet there they are in Egypt, very popular. And so why don't we have people called Pappus and Ptolemaeus in the Gospels? Quite simply, they weren't written about Jewish men in Egypt. If they had been, no doubt those would have been popular. So we can see that there is a very good alignment there. But there's a further element. You see, if lots of people are called Simon, you call out Simon, and lots of people have to turn their head because no one has a clue who you're talking about. So in fact, what we find is that with the most popular names, they found ways of disambiguating. You know what you've got in Wikipedia, disambiguation, distinguish one from another. And they have to do this with the Simons. So that's why when you read in the Gospels, you don't just have usually the name Simon, you have Jesus has 2 disciples out of his 12 called Simon. One is Simon with the extra bit Peter, or Simon Cephas. The other is Simon the Zealot, or he's also called Simon the Canaanite. They each have an extra bit on their name. In the book of Acts, then Simon Peter goes to stay with Simon the Tanner. We also find in the Gospels where there's a man called Simon the Leper, who doesn't seem to have leprosy at the time because people are actually having a meal with him. Maybe Jesus had healed him, but what we see is there's actually a bit added onto his name to make clear who he is. Who carries Jesus' cross? Simon of Cyrene. You find the same with the Josephs. Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph the carpenter. Mary is distinguished. Mary Magdalene. Mary the mother of James and Joseph. It can be the husband's name. It can be the town they're from. It can be their job. There's just got to be something there to distinguish that from other ones. And that's very important that you're doing that. A bit like what we have nowadays with surnames, which are used to distinguish people from other people with similar names. Now, there's a further element with names, and that is that actually names are very hard to remember because names are essentially arbitrary labels. Usually there's no correlation between the meaning of a name and the person who gets the name. That's not always the case, but most of the time there's no correlation. So they're very random things, and our mind very easily forgets them. It's called nominal aphasia, where we forget names, and it's one of those things that happens as we get older. Increasingly, we find it harder to put particular ties between a label and a person. But often there are people that we know relatively well. We know what their job is, what car they drive, we know something about their family, we know the last conversation we have with them, but just at that vital moment, we don't actually know their name. And we might be at a social function and we want to introduce someone to someone else, and there's all sorts of things we could say about that person, but we can't actually remember their name at the moment. It's quite embarrassing. And it's a very common thing. Think of all the films you've seen and how you can remember the plots of the films, and often you can't remember the particular names of the characters that they had within those. And often you can't remember the names of the actors and actresses, even if you've known them. So names are a very hard thing to remember. So think about this. If the Gospels have correctly got the thing that's the hardest thing to remember, namely the names, isn't there every reason to think they can get the stories right? Because names are far harder to remember than stories. And so if we've got the correct pattern of names, not just individual names, but their relative proportion in the Gospels, to me that's showing that the Gospel stories are coming to us at a very early stage in transmission, very early stage. If someone comes back from holiday, they might tell you that they met some interesting people. They might not even bother telling you the names of those people because they know you'd forget them anyway. They tell you the interesting thing about the people. So if we've got across all four Gospels correct labeling, correct naming of people, that suggests that as a whole, the material, broadly speaking, is first generation material. After 2, 3, 4 steps of being handed on in something like the telephone game, you're not going to be having the correct labeling. So it's a rather striking argument. But it's also something that we can apply to the very wording of the Gospels when we look at the name Jesus. You see, Jesus was a very common name, actually the 6th most common name that there was for Jewish men in the land at the time. And when we look at the Gospels, we can find that when you're reading a Gospel, of course, it's about Jesus, Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth. They don't need to keep relabeling him Jesus Christ or Jesus of Nazareth, because it's pretty clear which Jesus you're reading about as you read through the story. But characters in the narrative, if they're being reported correctly, are not in the same position. They're in a society where lots of people may have been called Jesus. So they can't simply say, Jesus is coming down the street, because people would say, which Jesus are you talking about? So this is a way we can break in, say, in Matthew chapter 21, and see in Matthew chapter 21, verse 6, the narrator says, they did just as Jesus had told them, a very plain mention of Jesus. But the crowds, when they're talking about Jesus, say, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee. They give you several ways of specifying the particular Jesus we're talking about. Then the narrator follows in the immediately next verse and says, Jesus went into the temple. So the narrator is speaking in a different way from the characters in the narrative. Or to give you another example from Matthew chapter 26, the narrator says, Jesus said to him, but then the next mention of Jesus is when Peter is denying Jesus, and a servant girl comes up to Peter and she says, you were with Jesus the Galilean. A slightly more clued up servant girl says, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. But the next mention of Jesus is Peter remembered the saying of Jesus. So the narrator speaks one way, the characters in the narrative speak another way. Again, we see Pontius Pilate giving the crowd the choice of whether they want Barabbas released to them or Jesus, who is called Christ. And again, that extra bit is very important for specifying which Jesus you're talking about. What shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? Above the cross, it says, Jesus, this is Jesus, King of the Jews. Even the angel at the empty tomb says to the women there, I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. So specify something about Jesus that marks him out. Now that's the pattern in Matthew's Gospel. It's also the pattern in Mark's Gospel. What do we have to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? The demons cry out. And the man, I like this case in Mark chapter 10, verse 47. Because here we have a disambiguation outside direct speech. but it's outside direct speech reporting what was direct speech. So here we have a blind man hearing that it was Jesus of Nazareth. He began to shout out, "Son of David, Jesus." Each case there is an extra bit. Similar situation to what's in Matthew's Gospel, where in Mark 14 verse 67, where Peter, the servant girl, says that you two were with the Nazarene Jesus. And again in chapter 16, the angel says, "You seek Jesus of Nazareth." Luke's Gospel has exactly the same pattern. "What do we have to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? What do I have to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Jesus, teacher, have mercy on us." In other words, the word rabbi used with Jesus to disambiguate him from other Jesuses. The same parallel to what we had in Mark's Gospel, where they told him that Jesus of Nazarene was passing by. He called out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." There is one case where there is no disambiguation, and this is when Jesus is on the cross and one of the brigands who is next to him on the cross says, "Jesus, remember me." But you've got to remember that is a one-to-one situation, a one-to-one conversation. It's not a crowd situation. And so it's not that you always have to use that disambiguation when you're talking to someone directly. And also, of course, people on crosses do not waste words. So that doesn't go against the pattern. And then finally, in the last chapter of Luke's Gospel, where it's said that Jesus is risen from the dead and he meets a couple of people and they say, "Well, haven't you heard what's going on?" And he said, "Well, what's been going on?" And they say, "Well, haven't you heard the things concerning Jesus of Nazareth?" Again, they disambiguate. The same pattern can be found in John's Gospel. Someone says, "Jesus, the son of Joseph from Nazareth," or "Isn't this Jesus, son of Joseph, whom we know?" There's one case in John when there is no disambiguation. It's John chapter 9, when there's a man who's born blind, and the passage says he was healed by Jesus, and it portrays him as gradually over this chapter 9 coming to know who Jesus is. And so at that point, when he actually doesn't know very much about who Jesus is, he gives him without a disambiguation. But again, that would fit the broader pattern that you need a disambiguation with that name. And then again, we have in John chapter 18, they go to arrest Jesus. Twice we have, "Whom are you seeking?" Jesus says, and they replied, "Jesus of Nazareth." Now, what we're seeing is these disambiguations occur with the most common names and not with the less common names. This is the amazing feature across all four Gospels. That is the sort of thing that would be the case if these Gospels were composed, or the material they're based on composed in the land. Made anywhere else, it would be rather different. The same pattern also occurs with the name of John the Baptist, John being a common name. You can run it through all of Jesus' disciples. In Matthew chapter 10, there's a disambiguator when it's a more common name, and when it's not, there isn't. Another area we can test the knowledge of the gospel writers is with the tax system. They mention tax a number of times. And in Matthew and Mark, you have this record of Jesus having a meal with a whole group of these tax collectors or toll collectors in the town called Capernaum, which is just off the top of the Sea of Galilee. That event isn't recorded in Luke or John, so it's only in Matthew and Mark. But in Luke, we find that actually there is a record of Zacchaeus, who is a chief tax collector, a chief toll collector, right down south in Jericho. So we've got these two different places. One place there's a chief tax collector, another place there's lots of tax collectors. And one's in Luke, the other's only in Matthew and Mark. What's so striking is that both of those places are border towns. Capernaum is the border town. When you go the land border from the east across to the west, you're going from one Roman territory to another. It's also a sea border. It's exactly the same down south in Jericho. If you're coming in from the east, you can't avoid going past Jericho. There are certain places you have to go across the River Jordan, and there's no other way up to Jerusalem. That's the way you're going to have to go. And so that's where they put toll collectors. It's exactly where you'd expect them to be. And that's the sort of familiarity that the gospel writers are regularly showing. And we can also look at the language question, and we can say the gospel writers show knowledge of language. In Matthew's gospel, we see that. In John's gospel, we see that. I particularly want to look at Mark, where we have a number of cases where Jesus is quoted speaking Aramaic. In Mark chapter 5, verse 41, he says, Talitha kum or Talitha kumi. And that means little girl, arise in Aramaic. He mentions the korban in chapter 7, verse 11. He says to a man with a speech impediment, he says, Ephata, be opened. And again, that's Aramaic in chapter 7, verse 34. The crowd call out Hosanna, which is a particular form of Hebrew, which is not, although it's a quotation from the Old Testament, it's quotation from the Old Testament in a form of Hebrew that's developed since the time of the Old Testament. Because actually, in the Old Testament, they said Hoshiana, and by the time of the New Testament, they said Hoshana. They had actually changed the wording and the sound because the language had changed. And so it's exactly the right linguistic form for the time and place. Jesus is recorded as calling God Abba, Father, and calling from the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, exactly the right language. And this is the sort of thing which a gospel writer is not going to be able to make up unless they've actually been to the land or had detailed conversation with someone in the land and said, exactly what did they say and how do you spell it? Because otherwise, how else are they going to be able to know this sort of language? You can't go to a bookshop in Rome and find a book which will tell you about the language that the peasants in Palestine speak. It just, no one would be interested in selling such a book. So this sort of familiarity is significant. Another thing we can say is that they lived at a time where there weren't standardized weights and measures. So just as the UK gallon is a bit different from the US gallon, and some countries use Celsius and some use Fahrenheit for temperature and so on, we find that there are different dry and liquid measures used in different places in the Roman Empire. So in Italy, you might use a modius as a dry measure. In Egypt, you'd use an artabar. And what's so striking is that when we look at the shortest parable recorded, attributed to Jesus in Matthew chapter 13, just 19 words, this is what Jesus says. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven or yeast that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. And what's so striking about that is the word measure. The word measure is a particular Hebrew word. It's sarton in Greek, which comes from the Hebrew sia, and it's a word that's that locality's word. So the gospel writers have this sort of familiarity that they're showing all of the time. In fact, we can even see with Jesus' parables that not only do you have those things, but you also have references to the Old Testament. And this is a particularly famous passage when Abraham entertains God and a couple of angels back in the book of Genesis, and 3 measures of flour is exactly the passage, the amount that's used there. And so Jesus got many of the details of his parables from the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures. And so you have to suppose that not only do we have the right measures for the time and place, but also the right mindset to be taking your stories from the Old Testament. Christianity began in the cradle of Judaism. Over time, we find that as more and more people became Christians, the familiarity with the Jewish scriptures went down amongst the Christians, because there were fewer who actually had come from a Jewish background. And yet the familiarity we have with the Old Testament within the 4 Gospels is absolutely huge. They come from that early stage. In Luke's Gospel, there's a story where a man called Zacchaeus, a chief tax collector I've mentioned, runs and climbs up a sycamore fig tree. That's really what it is. Ficus sycamorus is the species. And he is said to be a chief tax collector in the town of Jericho. And because Jericho is so low on the planet, it's actually got a different climate from elsewhere in Palestine. And what you find is that this is a specific sort of tree that does grow there, did grow there, was not known in Turkey, Syria, or Italy, because of course, they have a completely different climate that wouldn't sustain this tree. So to get that sort of detail, a gospel writer has either got to have been to the place to know that such trees grew in that place, or they've got to have had very detailed conversations with people. And so you realize all of these things come together to show you that the gospel writers at least had enough knowledge to get the story right. That doesn't prove that they got everything right, but they had enough knowledge to. They were close enough to things to be able to do that. And people may always dispute them, the miracles that are recorded, because some people have a problem with miracles, but we can at least say that the idea that they got the stuff wrong because it was simply told through so many different retellings that it changed won't explain the data we find within the text of the Gospels. Look at the text of the Gospels, you see they have lots of familiarity. Now I want to bring some of these things together into look at the one miracle which is reported in all four Gospels, and that is where Jesus is said to have fed 5,000 men, plus women and children, with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And in these four Gospels, we can actually see some little details. Mark tells you at the time that there was green grass. Doesn't strike anyone in England as very unusual, but actually it's unusual in many parts of the world. John tells you there's much grass. Now, is that a detail put in to make the story sound authentic for verisimilitude, or is it actually a detail which is remembered and passed on correctly? Well, let's come back to that. In Mark's Gospel, Mark 6:31, Mark tells you many people are coming and going, but he doesn't explain why people are coming and going. But then in John's Gospel, John 6 verse 4, it tells you that it was Passover time. Now, of course, Passover is the biggest festival in the year. It's like Christmas in the UK, Thanksgiving in the US. People travel for that. And so actually the addition that it's from Passover time explains the detail in Mark's Gospel. Many people are traveling because it's the peak travel time of the entire year. That's why Jesus wants to get aside from one of the main roads. He's actually on one of the main routes for traveling. Then in John's Gospel, Jesus asks Philip, his disciple, where to buy bread from. And then in John's Gospel, Philip and Andrew reply. Those are the two of Jesus' 12 disciples who have Greek names, by the way. Now, why does Jesus turn to Philip, and why do Philip and Andrew reply? John doesn't tell you. Just those are the disciples involved, doesn't tell you anything more. But in Luke's Gospel, it reports that the feeding took place near Bethsaida, which you remember is off the top of the Sea of Galilee. And what's so striking is that at the beginning of John's Gospel, we've learned that Philip and Andrew came from Bethsaida. In other words, if you read through John's Gospel on its own, you don't see any significance to the fact that he turns to this particular disciple and another disciple joins in the reply. But if you plug in the information from Luke as correct, suddenly you can explain the whole situation. Jesus turns to a man with local knowledge, and he and another man with local knowledge get involved in the reply. Even the little detail in John's Gospel that they were barley loaves that Jesus multiplied, given him by a child, exactly fits with the time of year when you've had the Passover, because when you're having Passover, because that's when you've just had the barley harvest. So that all fits together. But then you ask the question, well, would the grass really have been green? Well, I went to a precipitation chart of the nearest town I could find, Tiberias, and there we actually find that Passover generally falls around the beginning of April. It can vary a bit into March and April, but basically you've had 5 of the greatest months of precipitation leading up to this. Is the grass green at that time of year? Yes, it is. So even that little detail that we have in Mark about the green grass exactly fits with what we have in John about this being from Passover time. Those things come together and they form a picture together, suggesting that what we really have is something that's been handed down from very, very close to the events. But people say that doesn't prove the miracle. Miracles are hard to believe. But what I can say is this. A common way of explaining away miracles is saying that those stories arose and were exaggerated as they were recounted from one person to another over time. The problem with that idea is that it doesn't explain the little data that we found about the details, the eyewitness details of the event, because you'd have to suppose selective corruption of the information. whereby the biggest part of the story, namely the miracle, gets corrupted and all of the peripheral little things get kept in place. But of course the peripheral little things are the things that are the first thing that will get changed when a story is changing. So the fact that they are still in place suggests that things have been handed down with care. So all of these things come together, not to prove that the Gospels are historically true. I can't do that. But what they do show is that there are lots of the signs that we would normally think of as being very trustworthy. If it weren't for the miraculous elements within the Gospels, I think a lot of people would not have any difficulty accepting them. Moreover, if the Gospels came about from a conspiracy theory or from incompetent retelling, the pattern of what we have in the Gospels now is not what you would get. So all of these things come together to show us that the Gospels were not written over a very long period of time as a result of a very complex transmission. That wouldn't explain the data. All of these come together and show us that it's highly rational to trust the Gospels.